So I'm in degraded spekboom felt, and you can see that a lot of animal paths going through here on this side. There's a fence line contrast over there, so you can see there's really dense spekboom over there. Quite a lot of browsing that's going on here, quite a lot of Dacre browsing. But what's very interesting about this site is Cylindrophyllum, this short growing mesum that's fairly unusual in the Eastern Cape. It's considered something quite special, and something that's been kind of indicated as where we shouldn't be planting spekboom is wherever we find Cylindrophyllum, that spekboom might come in and kind of shade it out. Now, the interesting thing about this site, which is fascinating, it's the first time I've come across this, is if we just look up a little bit, here's a giant spekboom right here. There's another very big spekboom. Just remember that these things have been browsed back immensely. And yeah, the Cylindrophyllum seems to be doing quite well. Here's one that's died. And I think that's when we've been through a hectic drought, so it's probably been knocked around a bit. And so yeah, we've got an interesting thing that's happening here in terms of Cylindrophyllum growing right in there, right next to very large spekboom clumps. And just chatting with my very good colleague Adrian Hrobler, who's really knows his plants very, very well, is that he reckons that this thing's growing on very shallow soils, rocky outcrops, and that's what we've got here. You know, incredibly shallow. You know, it's a shale band with very shallow soils, and there's this like line of them that you can see. So there's one there, there's one there, there's one there. Okay, there's a couple down over there, but there aren't any in this section over here. So let's go down and have a look what's going on down here. So you kind of hit these little shallow beds. The soil's quite deep over here. You can see quite a bit of soil depth, and then yeah, you can actually look at this. You can see the soil here. Let's get in here, and yeah, it's fairly deep. It's just rain, so it's quite easy to get through. Okay, so slightly deep soils there. And where do we get the Cylindrophyllum? Bedrock. You can see the bedrock right here. Look at this. Yeah, straight into bedrock there. Little veneer. There's a little bit of soil going on in there, but yeah, there's bedrock right there. It's a very, very shallow layer. Yeah, and that's exactly where this population is. Come on, focus. And if you see this population here, and then we have a spekboom growing right next to it on these very shallow soils. But then we have this very big spekboom over there, and I reckon that's because it's on deeper soils. Remember, the spekboom roots are very, very shallowly, you know, they're in the top 20 centimeters. So this plant needs to have its roots going quite far out to be able to capture lots of water. And these plants, because there's so much bare rock around, can't have the same kind of catchment area, so they can't grow quite tall. And actually, I mean, just look at this here. We've got big plants just below this little section here, and then we've got these tiny little spekboom plants right in amongst the Cylindrophyllum, and they're just growing really small. And I'm sure that's because of they can't get the same rooting area, so they can't get going. So here we've got a Cylindrophyllum that's being a nurse plant for a little spekboom, and a whole bunch of other things, indigofera, Crassula muscosa, and there it is over there. Now, oh shame, these guys have been suffering in the drought. Look at it dying there. I'm pretty sure that's the drought. Might be being stepped on by browsing herbivores. And then, yeah, there we go, look. Tiny little spekboom, Cylindrophyllum, spekboom. So wherever the soils are, will be too shallow for spekboom to grow into giant plants. There's a Cylindrophyllum growing right in amongst two spekboom plants. There, and here's one growing, yeah, growing together there. And again, let's just go. It's so obvious now that I see it. That's spekboom, Cylindrophyllum, spekboom. Really shallow soils. Let's just go across and see where the soils are slightly deeper. Look at the size of that plant. So yes, if that plant was growing over here, it would shade out the Cylindrophyllum and we'd have a problem. But the fact that all of the spekboom's really small here says that it's a soil depth issue entirely. And you can just see that there's this like line. It's a geological line. You can see it going there. And everywhere that you follow this line and you see the Cylindrophyllums, there's tiny spekboom. Then it gets slightly off. There's tall, very tall spekboom. Now I was kind of worried about, whether this was an indicator of a different, is this an indicator of Nama Karoo? I think it's just very much an indicator of very shallow soils. So I suspect the reason why you wouldn't want to plant near Cylindrophyllum has got nothing really to do with protecting this plant species, but just because you're going to be wasting your money, because what's going to be happening is that you get plants that are looking like this. Now if you look here, so there's quite a thick root, spekboom root, that's obviously running from this plant over here, a bit close to it, but the soils are so shallow that it's being exposed. Now that's going to be losing moisture. It's not, that's not a great root, and so that's the problem, is that the soil isn't deep enough for it. Whereas I reckon that this plant is able to put its roots further down here to be able to support all of this biomass. And then, so we got really tall spekboom here, and I suppose the kind of opposing hypothesis then is that we shouldn't find Cylindrophyllum amongst the tall spekboom. So let's have a quick wander around the tall spekboom and see if nature wants to prove me wrong. It usually does. There's going to be some exception somewhere, but I'm really not seeing any. Nice tall spekboom. Yeah, nice tall spekboom. Yeah, tall spec. No Cylindrophyllum. None anywhere here. Probably going a bit fast. I'll slow down a little bit more. But there's some over there. Over there. And if we go up to that, we're going to have shallow soils and small spekboom. And then we get slightly taller spekboom behind that and no Cylindrophyllum. So in terms of concern about spekboom threatening Cylindrophyllum by planting too much, I think this quite clearly demonstrates that maybe it's not such a big concern, because the soils will keep them out. I mean, yeah, just look, spekboom right next to Cylindrophyllum, and I'm sure it's staying that small because it's just lacking root material. And then there's this big giant one right next door, because it must be slightly deeper over there. So the Cylindrophyllums are targeting very specifically shallow soils that tall growing plants can't get established on, because they can't get that same rooting area to be able to support them. Okay, so I completely agree with Adrian's hypothesis and his idea. Let me just show you this fence and contrast here between kind of the kind of lower end of moderately degraded getting onto severely degraded, and this side is looking it's still moderately degraded. We shouldn't be seeing pathways unless it's really shallow soils, but there's a lot more diversity on this side as well versus the other side, and yeah, it just you can see the difference. Even just in the plant structure, you can see how much browsing is happening over there, whereas there's far less browsing going on over here. Yeah, it's a very impressive site. Yeah, that fence line contrast demonstrates it the best, and we got degraded. Hopefully we're not losing too much spekboom. We're now finally getting around to the point of sustainable farming. Alrighty, cool. Hope that was interesting. Cheers, out.